Buen día, estamos nuevamente en nuestros webinars de INOS, el Instituto de Perspectiva e Innovación en Salud de la Universidad del Bosque. Hoy con un invitado muy especial que nos acompaña desde Detroit, Michigan, Alex Plum. Vamos a hablar hoy con Alex de un tema muy interesante que es el aprendizaje global. Como lo verán ustedes, es una temática que nos lleva a pensar en la innovación que surge en diversos contextos, en contextos muchas veces en los que hay dificultades, en los que hay limitaciones de recursos, pero que llega a posicionarse y a resolver problemáticas importantes. Alex es un servidor y líder que ha estado enfocado en mejorar la salud y la integridad de las personas que viven en esas zonas justamente en los márgenes, en mayores dificultades y vulnerabilidad. Está certificado por la Junta en Gestión de Atención Médica y su experiencia como ejecutivo de una organización sin fines de lucro se ha llevado hacia los determinantes sociales de la salud a través de modelos de atención basados en el valor, recogiendo muchas lecciones de cómo lograr la equidad en la salud y mirando de esta forma globalmente para aprovechar todos los contextos. Alex es una persona de fe, es un hombre de fe y con esto también busca conectar, inspirar y equipar a las comunidades para que sean canales para desarrollar su propia salud. De otra parte, Alex actualmente es el CEO y el director ejecutivo de Corner Health Center, el primer y más grande centro médico independiente del estado de Michigan en los Estados Unidos. Está dedicado a la atención primaria, conductual y social integrada de adolescentes. Alex allí es responsable de la supervisión estratégica, financiera y operativa de la misión del centro y trabaja para brindar atención asequible y libre de juicios a niños entre 12 y 25 años, así como a sus hijos. Antes de llegar a The Corner Health Center, Alex se desempeñó durante más de 7 años en puestos de dirección y de liderazgo en Henry Ford Health System, uno de los aliados de la Universidad del Bosque, en los equipos de salud poblacional y de salud global. También Alex es miembro del Colegio Americano de Ejecutivos de la Salud del Salzburg Global Fellow y ex becario Paul D. Coverdale, homenajeado por su servicio humanitario de la Universidad de Emory y voluntario y cuerpo de paz retornado desde Micronesia 2008 a 2011. Alex ha completado la formación de posgrado en una cadena de suministro internacional de atención médica, un MBA en Wayne State University, también allí en Michigan, en ciencias del comportamiento y en educación, un máster en salud pública de la Universidad de Emory y estudios teológicos como diácono certificado por el Seminario Teológico Evangélico de Carrera. Entonces, con él tendremos esta conversación y haremos algunas preguntas también para identificar cuál es el potencial de Global Learning, del aprendizaje global en salud pública. So, Alex, thank you again for being with us. I'm going to present your PPT so you can explain what we are talking about. Let me open the presentation, please. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Luis, for the invitation to come today and to talk a little bit about global learning for health equity and the work that we've been pioneering in the United States. I just want to first acknowledge my gratitude to the Universidad del Bosque. The work that's happening there in Colombia is of particular importance to our work in the United States. We've been really grateful to have as thought partners the health system in Colombia and particularly at the university. Some of the work that we've been doing in community health, particularly in cardiac health, has been informed by learning that we've done in partnership with the Universidad del Bosque. So thank you very much again, Luis, to you and the team and to all who've been part of that work in partnership with Henry Ford and I'm sure many other partners across the United States. Next slide, please. Well, I've already been introduced, so we can go to the next one. And I'll just disclose briefly that the funding for this, a lot of our work has come from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and that slides in this presentation today are the joint thought leadership of several people, including myself, but I want to just name briefly Karobia Archaria, Susan Mendy from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Yolanda Ogbalou and Virginia Rothran from the University of Maryland, Baltimore, Angele Bienvenu-Ichouet, and Dr. Wendy Leonard from TIP Global Health, and my former colleague, Doreen Donkerle at Henry Ford Health. Next slide. Today, I'm going to just give a very brief overview about the history of global learning as we see it, at least from the perspective of the United States, I want to acknowledge that's just one perspective. And so I'll talk a little bit about what this one perspective is and how we got started in the United States healthcare system, thinking about broadening our perspective. I want to introduce a framework that we've created called the Global Learning for Health Equity Framework, which is intended to help largely United States audiences identify opportunities to think and act globally in their local work. And then we'll walk through an example, and we're going to highlight one particular example today from some work that we've done in Detroit. And then we'll have a very brief discussion about that, and I'll take some questions before we conclude. Next slide. So let's get into a brief global learning example, please. Next slide. It's important to understand what we mean when we talk about global learning, because there's been different words used in this space over the course of our history, and we'll talk a little bit about how those words have escalated and changed over time. But for us particularly, global learning is a reciprocal and beneficial process. It's a process which is intended to be bidirectional in scope, where our focus is on thinking about and advancing the health of individuals who are on the margins. And that's at the heart of the practice of equity. And so here when we talk about global learning, our focus is on engaging with, exchanging, and adapting ideas and interventions that promote health equity between communities in ways that help us foster implementation benefits, which again reciprocate both to the communities who've originated those ideas and are beneficial to them and to the countries in high income settings, like in Detroit, where I'm located here in the United States, and in others. So that's what we're talking about today when we talk about global learning. Next slide. So why look globally? Well, as of 2015, there were at least 30 countries who had achieved higher life expectancy than the United States. Now, that means something to a United States audience. That might not mean as much outside of the United States. But what we know is that the United States spends more per capita on healthcare than any other country in the world. Our healthcare expenses are greater than most countries in the world GDP. And so when we think about the amount of money that is invested in the United States in healthcare outcomes, the fact that we are ranked somewhere in the bottom part of the first third globally of countries is an indicator that there's something that we're doing that isn't quite working, which is to say that you can keep throwing money at problems, but money alone does not solve the problems. We have to be really rethinking how we do healthcare, how we deliver it, and how we identify innovations that can achieve breakthroughs. So, some of these other statistics I think are important to note here. Since 1980, there have been more than 2,000 counties, which is a geographic distribution in the United States. 2,000 counties have had increases in mortality of more than 200% related to substance abuse and mental health disorders. We've looked particularly at the crisis of opioid addiction in the United States, which is a failure of the primary care system to talk to people about their pain and to find solutions that work. The United States healthcare system is broken. We segment care, we overly invest in specialty care, and we underfund and underinvest in primary care, which is what many countries around the world have really focused on. And so we are looking globally from the United States perspective, because we have to be reminded about the deep importance and the deep disparities in outcomes when we aren't looking at primary care solutions to drive this work. Next slide. Let's talk about the global learning movement for a moment. This is pictured is Dr. Anye Binigwaho. Dr. Binigwaho is the former Minister of Health for the Republic of Rwanda. She writes and says here, in Rwanda, we achieved extraordinary gains in health, doubling life expectancy and vaccinating more than 90% of children for 11 illnesses. This was not the work of one person or one ministry. With leadership from the top, we worked closely with villages, their community workers, and community health workers. I point this out because there have been people far outside the United States, and Rwanda is a great example of this. So is Ethiopia, so is Brazil. In many ways, so is Colombia. So is Cuba, for example, in primary care. Leaders who've been sharing the virtues of their primary care system, of the extraordinary gains that they've made in reducing mortality, particularly in infant and maternal health, and thinking through how to deliver care when there aren't the kind of resources that exist here. There have been wonderful examples around the world in this, and we're going to talk about a couple of them today. But there is a real opportunity here, and there has been for the United States over these last 10 years, for us to go and to visit some of these countries firsthand and to see dramatic, what she calls dramatic bottom-up improvements in lower and middle income countries who have far fewer resources. And that begs the question, with so many fewer resources, but so many better outcomes, what are we doing wrong in terms of healthcare delivery? Next slide. So an evolution of focus. In the early 2000s, as the United States PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief in Africa, generated a considerable investment throughout the African continent to try to stop and stem the tide of HIV spread. As they were doing that, medical practitioners involved in that work were identifying lessons for general practice, family medicine, and primary care that could be exported out of Africa and brought to the United States. This idea, quoted in a 2004 British Medical Journal article, was, the article was entitled Out of Africa, but the quote was, "Poor countries make the best teachers. It is not only what you spend on health, but how you spend it." And this was a real insight for a lot of leaders. So in the 2010s, about 15 years ago, we really started thinking through how we could achieve primary care cost savings. And that's where the focus on innovation led us into digital technologies and technologies that could be related to providing good enough care. So in the United States, for example, pregnant women also often receive and often desire to receive the visit with the obstetrician or the doctor's office where they get their ultrasound taken. And in the United States, that involves a woman going to the doctor's office, reclining on an exam table, having the jelly put on the wand and the wand put on her belly so that they can generate the ultrasonography of the fetus in the womb. And this is an important part in the United States of the obstetric process, the perinatal health process. General Electric, GE, the multinational firm, knows that using ultrasound and ultrasonography is an incredibly important tool at identifying fetal birth defects, ensuring the health of both the infant and the mother. And so they wanted to increase the access to this device, to this life-saving care outside of the United States, particularly in Africa and in India and in other developing countries that did not have the enough resources to ensure that every pregnant woman could come in for ultrasonography in the way that we do in the United States. And so they developed a briefcase-sized ultrasonography tool. Now, the picture that it generates is not nearly the level of resolution as in the United States. But the tool itself can be carried by a midwife, by a community health worker, or by other trained birth doula, for example, in remote communities. It works on battery power, and it generates enough information that it can be useful at both helping mother and baby connect in an emotionally meaningful way and identify concerns that need to be investigated more clinically and could result in referrals to secondary or tertiary care for that need. This focus on innovation and technology then started in Africa as a business venture for General Electric, but then had an opportunity to come back to the United States, where in places like Detroit, which are a largely low-income community compared to the rest of the United States, the opportunity was, would women in Detroit accept using a virtual ultrasonography machine as a way to have a more low-cost tool available to them to help drive healthcare improvements in primary care access? Unfortunately, what we discovered was no. In the United States, whether they were low-income women or high-income women, these women wanted to go to the doctor's office, they wanted to get the wand with the jelly on the belly, and they wanted to see the baby on the ultrasonography screen. And so what we found is that sometimes these innovations don't quite always make the return to the United States, but what it got us thinking about was why. And that leads to the third bubble in the evolution of focus, health equity. Because the truth is that women, whether low income, middle income, high income, any income, all women deserve dignity. And that should not be a breakthrough lesson in the healthcare field. It should be self-evident that people deserve dignity and they deserve honest and life-affirming care. And so in the process of perinatal care, what that meant was ensuring that women have access to the same resources regardless of income, but investing in the primary care process in such a way that we can afford to do that. Next slide. So the last thing I'll say on this kind of subject before we move into some examples is that words really matter. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, over a decade ago, embarked on an effort to actively learn from other countries and to surface solutions to accelerate progress toward a culture of health in the United States. And that's what gave birth to the Global Ideas for U.S. Solutions team, who have been advancing this work ever since. The last point there is an important one, because when I began this work about 10 years ago, the term that I used, along with many others, was reverse innovation. And that term has fallen out of favor and has become increasingly replaced by the phrase global learning. The reason for that is we don't want countries in any place, whether high income, middle income, or low income, to believe that if they identify something and then it goes to a high income country, that that innovation is working in reverse. Reverse implies that it's not forward or that it's backward, and that's simply not the case. So instead of putting a label on the direction, we want to surface and highlight that this innovation work is reciprocal. Whether it starts in any particular place, low income, middle income, high income, there's opportunity for all of us to learn from one another around the world if we'll simply be humble enough to do so, and as long as that our shared emphasis is on creating health equity for folks around the world. So let's jump now into the Global Learning for Health Equity framework. Will you go 2 slides ahead, Luis? This is the framework that we have been using in the United States. So I created this framework along with 5 colleagues with funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And the Global Learning to Advance Health Equity framework is a continuum. There is no starting or ending point on this journey. Each of the yellow items along the screen is intended for anyone that's interested in taking an idea that might originate somewhere else and trying to see and figure out how can we adapt it to make it fit into my context. Whether that's in the United States, learning from our friends in India or in Rwanda, whether that's someone in Colombia, learning from somebody else in China. The direction can flow any number of ways. And the idea is that each of the items on this framework are intended to provide insight and guidance as you go along the process of exploring for ideas, identifying the idea that makes the most sense to you, contextualizing the idea. How does it fit in our context? Examining the specific elements that could be changed, collaborating with other partners to facilitate that journey, planning to make the implementation make sense, adapting the specific elements that need to be changed for the work to go on, implementing that work so it can take off for the long term, measuring the outcomes over time so that we know what's been successful, sharing those lessons widely so others can uptake them, and then measuring and monitoring impact. So that's sort of all of the little bubbles on the outside as you go. On the inside are the values that underpin our work in the global health, a global learning for health equity space: trust, respect, reciprocity, and humility. I think these terms, each of them sort of speak for themselves in terms of their value. But in the United States, again, I'll repeat this, where we spend more per capita than any other country on our healthcare, for experts in the United States to maybe acknowledge that we are not, in fact, experts in healthcare delivery, if we spend the most and our outcomes are so much worse than many other countries, that takes a tremendous amount of humility. And so starting from that deep place of humility, understanding that any work we do learning from someone cannot be extractive or exploitative, but has to be reciprocal, then from those bases, with trust and respect with our partners together, we embark on this journey. So that's the framework. I want to walk through some examples now of how we have done that. So if you'll go 2 slides forward. I want to talk about the 2 U.S. host sites who have been the places where I have had the opportunity to practice global learning. As Louis stated at the beginning, I'm the CEO and executive director of the Corner Health Center, which is Michigan's first and largest adolescent health medical center. We serve 12 to 25-year-olds and their children. But before I came to the Corner Health Center 3 years ago, I helped pioneer Henry Ford Health's global learning program. And we, on the Global Health Initiative, which was started in about 2014, represents Henry Ford Health's expertise abroad, supporting the community health of individuals at home by doing global learning work. It's important to note that in Detroit and Southeast Michigan, our infant mortality rate of 14.1 per 1,000 is one of the worst in North. It is the worst in North America. It is some of the worst in all of the Americas. And again, the factors that underpin this in the Detroit context, we'll get into in a minute, but in a country which has more resources per capita for obstetrics care, for primary care, for birth, for doulas and midwives and all of these resources, the fact that infants in the city where I live and call home continue to die at a disproportionately higher rate than many people around the world, this is a severe and serious problem. It's one that exposes the inequity of our healthcare system and has been a fundamental reason why we've looked around the world for these inspirations and ideas to do this work. Next slide. In the United States, our big challenges have been around particularly social determinants of health burdens, what we call SDOH. So when we began this effort together with our partners, we wanted to understand how we could identify and contextualize solutions to this overarching challenge of infant mortality. And so we looked at the Corner Health Center. Our team, one of our challenges, we see over 100 patients a year. Every patient that we see gets 4 visits. These are pregnant women. Their 4 visits include a clinic-based visit for the mother, one for the mother and her baby after she's had delivery, and then we do 2 visits at home. Henry Ford Health in Detroit, it's a major health system. It includes multiple hospitals and dozens of primary care centers around Michigan, has over 1,000 obstetrics visits per month. All of the women that we see, or the vast majority of them, at least in Detroit, have high burdens related to their social determinants of health. These are things like lack of transportation, lack of reliable, safe, or secure housing, insecure food access, hunger, intimate partner violence, which is to say domestic violence or other violence in the home. And then, of course, things like low income, or in an even worse way, an acronym we call ALICE, which means asset limited, income constrained, but employed. These are individuals who work part-time or full-time, but even working full-time do not make enough money to be able to afford reliable transportation, housing that is safe and provides them with adequate shelter, enough food to live in a healthy way. In addition to all of this, and one of the real drivers, we believe, of the infant mortality disparities is structural racism. What is structural racism? The United States has a very long and very, very shameful history of treating Black and brown people differently from white people. And this has been maybe nowhere more pronounced than in Detroit, Michigan. In Detroit, many people who were former slaves or their children left the South, where they had been enslaved in the U.S. South, and traveled north to places like Michigan, which were never slave-holding states. But when they came here, they thought they were escaping discrimination and stigma in the South. And in fact, when they came up north, they found that even though Northerners didn't have slaves, they did hold a lot of the same racist, discriminatory viewpoints. This was serious. And so it meant that as Black folks began to take jobs in the plants, building automobiles and other manufacturing and industry activities, they were paid less. Oftentimes, they could not get mortgages for their homes. Their children were disrespected. They weren't provided the same educational opportunities. And so Black people were forced basically into a second-class status. And this is very much in violation of everything that most Americans will tell you they believe, which is that every American has the chance, should have the same equal chance, equal protection under the law, is what our Constitution says. And that just has not been the case for Black Americans or most brown Americans, including Native Americans in this country. And when you live under the mantle of that racist discrimination for so long, it has a physiological effect too. And we've begun to think more about and try to explore and understand how this racist history has come to impact Black Americans and why and how that's leading to infant mortality in Detroit, which has some of the highest percentages of African Americans of any city in the country. The last challenges, of course, of course, are fairly common across health settings in cities like Detroit or in many places in the US and probably around the world, loss to follow-up, no-show visits, and then high rates of comorbid conditions, depression, social isolation, and a lack of social connectedness, and then, of course, these high infant mortality rates. Next slide, please. So we started to think about where we could find ideas. So I'm going to talk today just about the work that we did in India for the interest of time. But there are two examples, and of course, always happy to connect with people later on to talk more about the work we learned from in Rwanda. Some of that information is on the right-hand side of the screen. TIP Global Health is formerly called the Ihangane Project, and that was based in the Ruli sector of the country Rwanda. So we're going to save that for another time. But I want to talk to you today about the work we did in India with an organization called CORD. CORD is the Chinmaya Organization for Rural Development, which is based in northern India in the remote area of Himachal Pradesh. It was founded in 1985 and today exists throughout the world through the CORD USA Global Network. CORD is a community-based organization, and they work primarily with women and children. Their focus has been on handicrafts and skills building for economic empowerment. They do microcredit and they protect legal rights. And their main location in Dharamshala in northern India also has a large clinic for children and families who have disabilities. What is central to their work are 4 values: participation, integration, networking, and sustainability. CORD believes that every community of any level of income, any level of resource, every community already has within it the power that they need to affect change for themselves and for their community. And by finding and locating and believing in and living out that power, they can achieve significant change. So the values of participation, integration, networking, and sustainability are the 4 values that help guide communities in their work to locate and act from that power. We went to India to understand more about that. So let's go to the next 2 slides. This is these are some pictures that I took on my visit, and you can see the mountains there in the background. Those are the Himalayas. And the Himalayas are, of course, the largest mountain chain in the world. They're the highest. And so this part of India also is close to bordering parts of Tibet, parts of China, and of course, the country Nepal. And so it was really lovely to be there. Just an absolutely beautiful part of the country. And we're really grateful to have had the opportunity to go and visit. So the next slide. So we conducted a learning visit to India, again, to Himachal Pradesh, to Dharamshala, so that we could contextualize and examine. Those are the 2 elements from that framework I mentioned earlier. So we could contextualize and examine their approach using those 4 values: participation, integration, networking, and sustainability. How would we apply those 4 values, what they call 4 pillars, to their work to promote the outcomes of positive health among mothers and babies? And so when we were there on our visit, our focus was on open-minded conversations. We sat with program leaders, we sat with women, we sat with children, we sat with volunteers at CORD, and we talked to other participants. We did site visits to families who were receiving services, and we dreamed with them. We asked them questions about their hopes. We wanted to understand how participation makes sense to them. What does it mean for their work to be integrated within all of the other resources of both their community and CORD? How did their work network with other organizations and other communities who were doing similar work? And how did this work get sustained? So that's what the site visit was focused on doing. Once we came back to Michigan, into our local communities, we continued this sense making, where we would talk about what we learned in conversation with our patients, the employees of the Corner Health Center, and our partners in Ypsilanti and Detroit who were working on the same kinds of work. Next slide. The big innovation that we identified through our work is called Mahila Mandal. Mahila Mandal, in the language spoken in that part of India, just means women's groups. Women's groups are the focus of CORD because women's groups bring women together from small communities, usually between 15 and 20 women, and they start to invest in their own community. So each time a Mahila Mandal, a women's group, meets together, they each bring a little bit of money and they invest it together into their shared account. This small investment by participants adds up over time. Each woman contributes a little bit of money as she is able. And in contributing that money, they're able to save up large amounts of money. With those microcredit investment amounts, they make loans to one another. Sometimes a woman will come and say, I need to buy a bull or a cow so that I can have milk, and then I'll sell the milk in the market and I'll pay you back. Another woman came and said, I need to have a loan because I want to invest in my son's clothing store. And they do it. They make the loans. Because these women all live together and they're in a small group, there is networked accountability built in to their social network, which means that the default rate, the rate at which people fail to repay their loan, is incredibly low. It's like 99% repayment rates, which is incredible. Very small interest rate, but these financial investments, when repaid with a little bit of interest, continues to grow the account. In doing all of this, what it is proving to the women is by putting their purchasing power together and making loans to one another and seeing one another succeed, they're growing in confidence. They're growing in decision-making ability. They're growing in their ability to control and take control of their own communities, their own families, and their own personal destinies. One of the stories that I love that I learned while I was there, after meeting with one of these groups, and then going and meeting with one of the women in particular, she told the story this way. She was a wife. She had started to come to the Mahila Mandal groups. She could not read when she started going to the Mahila Mandal groups. But over time, as a result of her participation, as she saw the women in her group start businesses, start selling things in the market, making money for themselves and their family, and repaying their loans, she grew in her confidence. One day, she realized that there were trucks going down the road and they were building wells in the villages that were just on the other side. And she was saying, well, why is no one building a well in our village? We don't have a well here. We have to walk many kilometers before we can even get our water from the well. And so she heard from somebody in a meeting that the village down the road had stolen the well, that they had bribed the contractors to go to their place and build the well in their city instead of hers. And she said, that can't be right. And so as she started going around, she realized, because she couldn't read the city notices that had been posted in her village, which explained the project. And so she taught herself to read. With the confidence of the women in her Mahila Mandal, and with their help, she learned how to read. And when she could read, she went back to those village signs and she saw, in fact, that was their well. It had been stolen by that village, and that well was supposed to be for her community. And so the next time those trucks came down the road, she saw them coming, she heard the rumble, she organized all the women of the village, and they staged a sit-in in the road so the trucks could not pass by. And so when the men got out of the trucks and were yelling at the ladies to move, she said, no, 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 you will build that well here. It is our well. See? And then she got the documents and she showed the man what it said, and he agreed. He couldn't argue with her, and so they built the well there. Now, this is just one example, but it's the kind of example that when women participate together, when they are working on their own integrated health needs, because the truth is water, economic development, and health, all of these things are integrated. You can't just achieve health if you're not also focused on women's empowerment financially and also focused on women's empowerment personally. And so all of these things are integrated together. So when they participate, when their needs are fully integrated together, when they are women networked as a community together and networked with resources that exist in other communities, then their outcomes can be sustained. And those are the 4 values. So I'm just really proud of that. We're going to skip the next slide, Luis. And I just want to go to the summary here. That's a really powerful video, and it might be worth watching some other time in the future, but you can skip it for now. It just tells another story of a woman whose life was transformed through this work, and it's a powerful story. Maybe we can share the link in some of the show notes. So the summary of this, though, that I just wanted to highlight today is that for the United States specifically, our focus in learning from India was to take those outcomes, those participation, the integration, the networking, and the sustainability, and bring them to our maternal infant health program. The focus that we have tried to do in Detroit has been, if we can get women to pool together, pull all of their resources together as well, financial resources, their time and effort, their families, pull them together in a common location. Can we also inspire them? Can we help them locate their own power? And with that power, can we start to see their health outcomes improve? I'm grateful to say at the Corner Health Center, we've never had a mother lose a baby. And that is a powerful, powerful reality. Our organization has taken a lesson out of the playbook of India. We are learning from India, and we make sure that the women in all of our maternal infant health and obstetrics programs are partnered together with other women in the same cohort, integrated with all of the medical services available at the Corner Health Center, networked with other community partners who are also working with these women. And together, we're able to sustain this because of the deep meaning of relationships. There are multiple forms of global learning that exist. Some forms of global learning are procedures or practices like what we're doing in learning from India. Some are devices and tools like what I talked about with General Electric, GE, and that portable ultrasound machine. The truth is that each of these global learning ideas are designed to take what has worked well in one location, to adapt it and adopt it in a new location. And our focus has always been on doing that in partnership with our folks in India. I'm currently working on an article that we're writing with and being senior authored by our friends in India, so we can tell their story and they can tell their story. They had the inspiration. We just adapted a part of it to work with women in Ypsilanti and Detroit. So this joint learning and joint problem solving, whether the outcome happens in India where it started or whether it happens in Detroit, the focus has got to remain on continuing to achieve the equitable health improvements of people on the margins. That always has to be the center. And so I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity to have been able to have done that. So if you want to go to the next slide, these are some discussion questions that we've used when we've been in conversation with groups. Sometimes when I present this, we'll ask some of these questions because these are kind of practical guiding questions as we think about how we take global learning and we bring it into the work that we've been doing. The next slide, Luis, has got additional resources for individuals who may be interested in exploring more about global learning. The first couple of links are actually websites where folks can go and they can see thousands, hundreds and thousands of innovations from around the world that have been identified by both high-income and low-income settings as particularly insightful or promising to achieve health equity or to achieve other improving outcomes. And then there's a couple of journal articles on the bottom that just talk more about why this work matters, both for quality of life and other health equity outcomes. So with that, you can go to the last slide. This is my contact information. I would welcome your emails. You can learn more about the Corner Health Center at our website. And you can also learn more about the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's funded Global Learning for Health Equity Network by visiting the University of Maryland's website at umaryland.edu/GL4HEN. I'm really grateful to Universidad del Bosque today, Luis, to you, and to all of our colleagues for the invitation to come. I really hope that this has been a helpful introduction at a high level to why we're doing global learning and to what we want and hope to achieve in it in the United States. But the last thing I might say is I really also hope that we don't lose sight of gratitude and, again, humility. Gratitude and humility, appreciation for our friends in India specifically, for you all in Colombia, and for friends around the world whose missions has been just to increase the amount of health and hope and healing available for folks on the margins, the folks in our communities, our neighbors. Thank you very much.
No, I have to say thank you, Alex, again. It was a great presentation, very inspiring presentation. I found a lot of information so important, so relevant for our students, for our colleagues in public health, in community health, that maybe they are absolutely amazed, like I am, of your work, and thank you very much. So I just like to have a small conversation with you, and maybe with a couple of questions. Okay, so let's say, Lex, could you please explain what's the main difference between the reverse innovation and global learning? You explained the change of the terms, but to go a little bit deep inside, what's the difference between two approaches?
I think at its heart, reverse innovation is intended about market capitalization. Reverse innovation is really about taking a market idea that has worked in the United States and trying to tone it down. So, for example, we talked about the ultrasound machine. Another example of a reverse innovation that's been effective has been smartphones. Throughout Africa, what we found, or what I've read at least, is that most people throughout the continent of Africa cannot afford an Apple iPhone or even a very fancy Google phone, but they still want a smartphone. So how do you provide a device which has many of the same smartphone features, the integrated map, for example, music listening, email, social media, but maybe doesn't have the same capacity as an iPhone or the same capacity as a Google Pixel, something like that. And so the idea is, can these large corporations, Apple, GE, Coca-Cola, Sony, anybody, develop a technology or take a technology from the United States and then tinker with it so it could sell at a more affordable price point in a country which doesn't have that kind of income? Once they have it, then can they reverse import it back to the United States at that lower price point for a community in the United States that might accept it? Now, where I think that runs against global health equity is that many people in the United States will say, I want the iPhone. I'm an American. I deserve an iPhone. They feel like you're trying to sell back to them an inferior good. And that, again, I'm not putting a value judgment. I'm just stating what we've heard from the folks that we've worked with. It's like the ultrasound machine. They thought that was inferior. They want to go to the doctor's office. They want to get the wand. They want to see the picture. And that the mobile device was not sufficient for them. I think that the global learning for health equity takes at its starting point not money. Reverse innovation takes at its starting point money. How do you capitalize on an item and make money off of it? And that's okay. That's not a bad thing, but its starting point is money. Global learning for health equity doesn't take money. It takes human dignity as the starting point. How do we think about the health of humans, particularly the disadvantaged, the marginalized, the vulnerable, and how do we put them in the center so that we can achieve more equitable health outcomes? So it's just a different focus. Even though at the end of the day, we might use the device, we might use the approach, but I think it's the focus.
Sure. So let's go to the next question. And you just presented this nice experience from India. And I would like to ask you, what do you think are the main characteristics of an innovation or an idea or a process to be considered as part of a global learning process or program?
That's the $1 million question. And I think that I think about it across a couple of domains. I mean, ultimately, it has to be creative. I think the thing with India, honestly, not the most creative. What's creative about it in India is that they have been so successful with women repaying those loans. But we've seen microcredit schemes, Grameen Bank, BRAC in Bangladesh, other parts of Southeast Asia have been quite effective in microcredit loans. I think for women, though, using women's groups particularly, the way that they've made loans to women, and then the way that they've nested it within healthcare, that was more creative for us. Because in the United States, at least, healthcare and banking, financing, that's completely separate. And in India, where they don't have such elaborate separate schemes, it just all happens together. So that creativity, when we saw that, for us said, aha. Now, the truth is, in where we are, we're not doing the microcredit banking right now. We've talked with some women who are nervous and skeptical, and I understand that. One of the ways that we have tried to approach it, though, is by writing off care or putting patients on a sliding scale who can't afford health care. That's kind of an investment. It operates differently because these women aren't making loans with the savings from that. That speaks more to the complexity of the US healthcare and banking regulations than the idea. But the creativity as an element really got us thinking. Another thing I might highlight is the simplicity. A simple innovation, something that does not take a tremendous amount of time or resources to go, these often end up being very successful. One of the examples I talk a lot about is the friendship bench, which was popularized in Zimbabwe and is taken off around the world. This is not a complicated expense. This is literally building a large bench or some seating in a comfortable place, but in a central part of town where you can have trusted people go from time to time to talk with people. And of course, when they start talking, they reduce isolation, they reduce loneliness, they get people outside of their own bubble, they get them talking, they reduce depression, they reduce anxiety. It takes nothing. It's such a small intervention, and you train a couple of people. You train the librarian, you train the town sheriff. You train a couple people to come to the bench every once in a while. And so I think creativity, I think simplicity, and then I think if there's a third value, as I think about the programs that we've worked with, I think at the end of the day, it has to take as its starting point the buy-in of the community. The truth is, if we came along with an intervention like the ultrasound machine and people were like, we don't want it, well, it's never going to go anywhere. But for us, we came and we said, hey, listen, would you all like to spend time together in a women's group among our patients? We would be happy to buy dinner once a week, and we'll provide childcare so you can just come together and socialize. Yes, 100%. So we were able to take, the values of it, but there was a groundswell of support and interest among the women we were working with. So I think those are maybe three keys. Creativity, it's got to be innovative, new, simple. It can't be highly expensive. It's got to be fairly refined. And then there has to be a strong willingness in the community to, it resonates with their desires.
Fantastic. I totally agree. I remember that experience from the Friendly Bench. So from one of our colleagues in El Bosque, we've been talking about that and try to scale that experience in Colombia. She has a lot of work there, so I remember that. And you're right, this is very interesting solution. Let's go to the last question. Do you have any experience in this approach of global learning here in Latin America or in Colombia that you can mention now? And this is because we are working from El Bosque University, from INOS, from Hub, in a lot of projects to trying to map, to search for innovations. Most of them are in this side of community health solutions. And I just want to know if you have this experience or if you remember any of them.
I do. In fact, two of the innovations that really got me excited about this work came out of Latin America. The two that I'll think of right now quickly are in Mexico and in Cuba. Let me go with the Cuban model first. It's actually not simple, and it is creative. The Cuban primary care model uses promotoras to go in the favelas to each person's home. The promotoras go, I think, twice a year. And then annually, they also see a physician. Cuba in Latin America in terms of its per capita investment, is maybe right behind the United States. In terms, I mean, they direct an enormous amount of their country's GDP toward healthcare. But boy, is it paid off, because primary care is you probably get better primary care access in Cuba than maybe anywhere else in the world. And so the primary care rates of disease there are just way down. And it just goes to show. I mean, I use this as an example because from the American perspective, with what, Americans, the way Americans talk about Cuba, the embargoes, how they talked about Fidel Castro, Cuba has always been the bad person in the eyes of most Americans. And why? Because we disagree politically on these things. When you go to Cuba and you meet Cubans, they're incredibly nice, warm, welcoming, friendly people who have an amazing primary care system, a primary care system that, I had a doctor's office visit this morning. It took me 3 months to get a follow-up visit with my doctor, and I was there for an hour and a half. So but I wasn't getting care. I was waiting an hour and a half. This is in America. That's not acceptable. So Cuba I use Cuba as a great example. And the other one I want to talk about, and I say that it's a great example because they chose that. You can do it when you choose it. If you have the resources, in America, we could have the same outcomes as Cuba. We just don't invest our money that way. And so we have a lot of power if we just choose to use it. Okay, so that's one. 2 is Mexico. My friend Abner Mason created the firm Consejo Sano. And Consejo Sano was intended, and it faced some regulatory challenges, but for people living across America, but primarily in the U.S. South, who were Spanish language speakers and who did not feel like they had either documentation or the fluency to interface with the U.S. medical system, could rely on Consejo Sano to receive medical care from trained physicians in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. This was a low-cost technology. It's a phone number. And then later on, it became a digital application on the mobile phone, on the smartphone. And it delivered amazing results because Consejo Sano's model, again, started with, what do people need? They need access to healthcare that is reliable, high quality, safe, and timely. And if you are an undocumented immigrant, a person without papers in the U.S. South, if you're a migrant worker, or even if you're a natural-born citizen, but you grew up and you don't speak English very well because you haven't needed that in your community, and your community, because you're rural, doesn't have access to great healthcare or timely healthcare, you can get it on demand. And so Consejo Sano saw that market opportunity, saw that there was a resource, physicians and medical experts outside the United States who could provide the service for much cheaper than we can in the United States, can deliver it on demand, and can deliver it conveniently over the phone. No brainer. It was so smart. And so I saw that and I went, see, again, that, Luis, is what told me all of these innovations will only be acceptable and successful if the community wants them. And that's, I think, maybe that's the biggest advice that I take when I think about reverse innovation over here and global learning over here. We want health equity. We all want more equitable outcomes for poor folks, for Black folks, for women, for children. We want them. But at the end of the day, the lesson from reverse innovation is you got to have a market. You've got to have people demanding it. You've got to have interest. And when you bring these things together, whether it's through the Cuban primary care system, innovations like Consejo Sano, interventions and processes like what's taking place in India, Rwanda, Brazil, Colombia, that's really how we achieve those big breakthroughs. So those have been some of my big inspirations, and I'm grateful for the folks in Cuba who've been ambassadors of this work. They've invited Americans to come down and learn, to Abner Mason and to colleagues throughout Mexico and the folks at Consejo Sano and many other inspirations. And you too, Luis, you're an inspiration too in the work that's been happening there at El Bosque and our the work that we've been able to do, particularly in the cardiac space through Henry Ford. So again, I'm just really grateful to have had an opportunity to be invited and to come and talk a little bit about this today. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Alex. It's been a pleasure to speak again with you. It's been a long time from our last conversation. So I would like to say we are very interested in keep going this conversation, and hopefully we can have a new opportunity to talk together and to work together. Thank you, Alex Blum from Henry Ford Health System and Corner Health. It was an amazing presentation, and thank you so much. Con esta presentación de Alex Blum queremos invitarles nuevamente a que nos sigan en nuestras redes y continúen observando nuestros podcasts y nuestros webinars sobre innovación en salud. No obstante, vamos a continuar con este interesante tema en el que Alex Blum nos dejaba varias reflexiones muy valiosas para lo que hacemos. En primera instancia, la necesidad de tener un trabajo coordinado con las comunidades, de encontrar aquellas iniciativas que tienen valor, que son creativas, que pueden llevarse a cabo y que tienen la capacidad también de cambiar el destino y el futuro de nuestras comunidades y, ¿por qué no?, ser escaladas en otros entornos. El mensaje del aprendizaje global que nos deja hoy Alex nos hace pensar en aquellas experiencias comunitarias que frecuentemente hemos conocido en nuestro desempeño desde el campo de la salud, desde la salud pública, desde la salud colectiva, y que en efecto nos han dejado esa sensación de que todavía podemos hacer mucho más por las comunidades y por lograr, como nos decía también Alex, la equidad en salud en nuestro país y en nuestras regiones. Pero por eso mismo, hoy hemos invitado y tenemos el placer de contar con Andrés Gómez, el gerente de innovación social de INOS y del Hub IX de innovación de la Universidad El Bosque. Andrés hoy nos va a dar también su perspectiva, sus experiencias, su conocimiento sobre lo que significan este tipo de desarrollos, de proyectos, porque él los conoce de primera mano y ha trabajado con las comunidades y con un gran número de innovadores y emprendedores para desarrollar soluciones. Entonces le vamos a dar la bienvenida a Andrés Gómez, como ya lo dije, gerente de innovación social en el Hub IX de la Universidad del Bosque. Muchas gracias, Andrés, y bienvenido. Te escuchamos.
Hola, Alejandro, y hola a toda la comunidad INOS. Para mí es un placer y para el Hub IX es un placer poder estar en este espacio, conversar acerca de la innovación social y el impacto del ecosistema de salud. Es algo que no solamente nos apasiona aquí en el Hub y en la Universidad del Bosque, sino también de manera muy directa nos permite tener un entendimiento de qué significa tener impacto en salud. Yo lo primero que quiero decir es entender el impacto en salud significa entender esto que ustedes están viendo aquí de fondo, entender que existe algo que es muy interesante y es cómo ponemos en el centro las personas cuando estamos hablando de innovación. Y ustedes han venido teniendo un ciclo sobre la importancia de qué es la innovación, cómo se genera la innovación y cuáles son sus diferentes vórtices. El día de hoy ustedes van a escuchar experiencias que estamos teniendo y que vienen de la mano de la presentación anterior en la cual, por ejemplo, nos mencionaba la importancia de trabajar de manera intersectorial, la importancia de trabajar de manera creativa, la importancia de generar valor social en salud y sobre todo la importancia de poder conectar eso que nosotros sabemos hacer muy bien con lo que la gente día a día está teniendo en cualquier parte del mundo, en cualquier región del mundo, sin importar cuál es su contexto o cuáles son las necesidades. Yo hago parte de la gerencia de innovación social. En la gerencia de innovación social del Hub, nosotros intentamos conectar y entender a todos los actores del ecosistema. Como dinamizadores y constructores de este ecosistema de salud, siempre tratamos de ver que hay diferentes aristas y, por lo tanto, en ese orden de ideas, siempre intentamos poder llevar soluciones que faciliten, por un lado, tener mayor capacidad de respuesta a las necesidades en salud de las personas. Segundo, tener equidad en salud. Tercero, generar soluciones que faciliten la resolutividad en salud, pero también la oportunidad en salud. Y por último, donde la gente se sienta identificada con todas estas cantidades de opciones, de dispositivos, de estrategias, de muchas cosas que se han venido construyendo a lo largo de este tiempo en el ecosistema de salud en Colombia, en la TAM y también en el mundo, y que para nosotros ha sido de muy gran aprendizaje. Lo primero que quiero mostrarles a todos ustedes, los que nos están viendo, es yo quiero que ustedes partan de esto que están viendo en el fondo. Esto es una interacción que parte de la ruta del paciente que trabajamos aquí en Colombia. La visión que ustedes acabaron de ver es una visión internacional, que es una visión que comparte algunos elementos importantes, como por ejemplo entender que todos trabajamos desde la promoción, desde la prevención, desde la atención, desde el cuidado, la rehabilitación y algo que nosotros hemos intentado hablar acá también en el área que se llama reconexión. Ustedes se pueden imaginar que cuando, por ejemplo, tenemos y trabajamos con pacientes con algún tipo de limitación visual ya sea grave o mínima, lo primero que nos dicen a nosotros es: a mí me duele haber dejado mi profesión como odontólogo, a mí me duele no volver a ver, a mí me duele no poder volver a estudiar. Y en todas esas cosas que nosotros hemos visto, algo que nos ha parecido muy interesante es qué tan preparados estamos como sociedad para aprender a reconectar, más allá de generar procesos de promoción, prevención, atención, cuidado y rehabilitación. Lo segundo que yo quiero que ustedes vean acá, y que por supuesto ustedes lo han visto de manera permanente, es que interactuamos con todos los profesionales en salud. Nosotros trabajamos con profesionales en salud y también trabajamos con diferentes sectores: industria, gobierno, trabajamos también con la academia, con la cooperación internacional, con las alianzas, con pacientes, usuarios, cuidadores, entre otros. Al final de cuentas, el mensaje grande sobre la innovación social es cómo haces que eso que tú estás haciendo desde una startup, desde el gobierno, desde la academia, desde la investigación, desde los semilleros, desde donde quieras cuando estás pensando en salud, puede impactar a ese paciente que está en su casa en este instante y que está diciendo: ¿cómo hago yo para tener una calidad de vida? ¿Cómo hago yo para tener un bienestar? Cuando a mí me invitaron a este webinar, algo que me ponía a pensar muchísimo, y por eso agradezco mucho a Alejandro la invitación y por supuesto a Inos, es qué significa innovación social cuando suena muy etéreo en términos generales. La innovación social significa, por ejemplo, desde Colombia, entender que en nuestros 32 departamentos hay muchísimos municipios, corregimientos, veredas y lugares donde la gente día a día está con complicaciones en salud que podrían ser muy bien atendidas y que pueden ser atendidas desde los centros urbanos, pero que estas personas no tienen acceso a esas posibilidades, porque eso significa, por ejemplo, algo tan sencillo como un gasto de bolsillo. Gasto de bolsillo que significa: tengo que subirme en una lancha, tengo que pagar un carro y tengo que pagar un avión para poder ir a que me traten algo que no es tan complicado. La innovación social significa, uno, entender contexto. Y es algo que yo he aprendido mucho de la mano de todos los médicos y especialistas como Alejandro, como Carlos Felipe u otros que acompañan también Inos, y es: existen unas condiciones que nosotros hemos llamado determinantes sociales. Ahora nosotros también queremos hablar sobre determinantes contextuales de la salud, y es: pueden existir todas las condiciones e infraestructuras para que podamos trabajar de manera permanente en una mejor atención y oportunidad, pero hay una brecha grandísima entre lo que es la infraestructura que está dispuesta versus la capacidad que pueden tener personas en acceder a toda esta infraestructura para tener una mejor salud y un mejor bienestar. Lo segundo, cuando uno habla sobre innovación social, es qué significa la innovación social en el camino de las personas con las que estamos trabajando. Muchas de las veces cuando hablamos de innovación pensamos que tenemos que ser súper disruptivos y crear cosas únicas y crear cosas maravillosas, pensamos que solamente es tecnológico, y resulta que cuando empezamos a hablar sobre innovación social, empezamos a hablar sobre algo que es muy interesante, que se llaman los dispositivos comunitarios. Estos dispositivos comunitarios lo que permiten es interactuar entre la persona que está al otro lado y lo que yo estoy proponiendo como valor en salud, basado en tecnología, si me lo permiten. Y esa interacción es muy interesante en el sentido de qué tan preparado yo tengo a mi público para empezar a trabajar. Si yo estoy trabajando con los pacientes, si yo estoy trabajando con los cuidadores, estoy entendiendo su contexto, estoy entendiendo su cultura, estoy entendiendo sus niveles de formación. Si yo mando una tecnología, esta persona quiere estar del lado de la tecnología o no. Y algo que me parece muy maravilloso es poder entender que algunas veces a nosotros todavía nos encanta que Alejandro, que por ejemplo, que es médico, Alejandro nos atienda en persona. Para mí esto que estamos haciendo en este instante de poder conectarme con ustedes a través de una pantalla, todavía para otros es muy difícil de poderlo entender en un punto de poder captar y conectar las conexiones entre lo que significa el uso de las tecnologías y la buena gestión de salud. Aparte de eso, para nosotros, entonces, digamos, primero se reconoce el contexto, segundo se reconoce todo lo que nosotros estamos trabajando en términos generales de qué tan preparados estamos como personas, como usuarios, como pacientes para poder trabajar. Y hay algo que me parece mucho más valioso, es que tan colaborativo son las soluciones que estamos trabajando entre los dos áreas. En ese orden, yo algunas veces, digamos, la invitación cuando empiezo a hablar de innovación sociales, realmente entiendo la necesidad del actor con el que estoy trabajando, realmente he codiseñado con el actor con el que estoy trabajando, le he preguntado qué tan cómodo las palabras que utilizo, la forma, la interfase, todo lo que estoy usando realmente se está conectando con lo que realmente está necesitando la persona al otro lado. Entonces, en términos de innovación social es ver esto que ustedes están viendo en el fondo como un ecosistema de interacción, como un ecosistema que permite entender un desafío en salud con una solución, con unos solucionadores y que de alguna u otra manera conecta realmente con lo que necesitan las personas para tener oportunidad de atención y desenlaces. Hay dos puntos claves que nosotros hemos intentado trabajar en la innovación social y el primero es, ¿y esto de qué manera se habla de manera diferente? ¿Cómo yo hago para no utilizar tantos términos técnicos? Y sobre todo, ¿cómo hago yo para saberlo comunicar? Hay un gran esfuerzo que nosotros intentamos hacer con todos los grupos. Nosotros aquí en la Gerencia de Innovación Social y en general en el Hub trabajamos siempre en la base de los científicos. Los científicos siempre están en la base y para nosotros es muy importante que los grupos de investigación, las personas que tienen experiencia, nos digan y nos validen que la solución que estamos planteando tenga un soporte académico muy valioso. Esa es, digamos, nuestra primera capa. Nuestra segunda gran capa es, hay un conocimiento que es técnico, pero ahora, ¿qué pasa? ¿Cómo lo transmitimos hacia las personas que no necesariamente tienen la misma capacidad de formación o no han tenido las mismas oportunidades de formación? En otros términos, en otras palabras, ¿cómo lo transmitimos a esas personas que lo necesitan? Entonces empezamos a hacer un esfuerzo muy interesante y es, ya no empezamos a hablar sobre frecuencia de atención, prevalencia, sino, por ejemplo, cuántos casos existen y de qué manera mucho más natural empezamos a aterrizarlo en las personas y en las comunidades para que sea mucho más orgánico. Y ahí en esa capa entendemos que las personas nos empiezan a decir a nosotros, esto que ustedes están hablando, nosotros aquí lo referenciamos y lo vemos de una manera diferente, porque eso para nosotros se llaman determinantes contextuales, que no solamente es entender la persona de qué vive y cómo vive, sino también de qué está rodeado y cómo es su red de apoyo en general. Posterior a esto, el segundo elemento que nosotros tenemos transversal es la comunicación. En términos de comunicación, la apropiación social nos da elementos para hacerlo diferencial, para tener en cuenta que las personas con las organizaciones o cualquiera que haga parte de la solución se hace copartícipe, codiseña y se apropia y la sostiene en el tiempo. Y la comunicación de mostrar los resultados también es muy interesante. Mostrar los resultados en salud es un desafío de manera permanente. Hablamos siempre de oportunidad, resolutividad, equidad, atención, entre otros, pero más allá de eso en términos sociales es cómo, por ejemplo, las comunidades analizan estos desafíos que se están trabajando dentro o que se están generando en sus contextos y de ahí cómo esos desafíos los convierten en una oportunidad de acción con todos los actores que los acompañan, secretarías de salud, cooperación, academia, empresa privada, otros que se consideren alrededor de. Y ahí nosotros empezamos a trabajar soluciones comunitarias o dispositivos comunitarios que son de muy bajo uso de tecnología, por ejemplo, de mucha adaptación de tecnología, pero que sobre todo son capaces de entender el contexto en el que se están dando. Hay una aclaración que debo hacer en este proceso y es, la innovación social no es un único atributo de las comunidades de base o de las organizaciones. La innovación social es un eje transversal que impacta organizaciones públicas, privadas, gobierno, sociedad civil, cooperación, a todo el mundo. ¿Por qué? Porque la innovación social, para mí, o lo que yo he aprendido en todo este tiempo, es la capacidad de hacer propio una solución que pueda ayudarme a tener una respuesta a un desafío que ha sido un detonante de preocupaciones en mi bienestar mental, físico y espiritual para aquellos que, digamos, consideran estas tres verticales en el día a día de las personas. Todo esto que nosotros le estamos diciendo responde principalmente a un contexto y para nosotros la innovación social siempre va a considerarse como la oportunidad, uno, de entender el contexto, dos, de dar soluciones que sean pertinentes y efectivas y tres, la capacidad de conectar cualquier público con lo que tú estás queriendo hacer. Para hacerlo hay muchísimas formas, hay muchísimas metodologías. Lo primero que queremos decirles es, creen de manera disruptiva, salgan de la caja. Si hay otras cosas que ya existen, rompan también esos esquemas y tratan de cooperar con esas organizaciones o soluciones. Pero sobre todo la innovación social tiene algo que para mí es magnífico y es la capacidad de conectar y articular muchos actores en torno a un gran desafío en salud. Ahora bien, si se los quiero bajar a ustedes en un ejemplo que nosotros hemos hecho diversos proyectos, grandísimos proyectos, pero creo que uno de los que yo puedo referenciar acá, que me ha parecido muy, muy interesante, se llama Tambores de Vida. Nosotros en su momento, nosotros trabajamos actualmente con muchas asociaciones de pacientes de enfermedades raras Y nosotros empezamos a entender un poco el contexto de que es una enfermedad rara, que es una enfermedad huérfana, cuál es su prevalencia en Colombia, su frecuencia de atención, su distribución, etcétera. Pero después nos dimos cuenta que habían algunas que se querían trabajar de manera mucho más específica desde los pacientes y nos acercamos a esta que se llama drepanocitosis. Y la drepanocitosis es una condición huérfana rara que tiene una alta presencia en comunidades afrodescendientes. Muy brevemente esta anécdota que tuve, porque cuando yo creé ese proyecto, cuando lo creamos con el equipo, algo que me pareció muy interesante es que yo al proyecto, sin haber interlocutado inicialmente con la comunidad, le coloqué marimba de vida. Ya me parecía que era un nombre muy poderoso. El proyecto lo que intentaba era conectar procesos de entendimiento de qué significa la drepanocitosis, de cómo poderlo transmitir a cualquier edad, de cómo poderlo conectar, de cómo poder generar documentos de incidencia en política pública para tomadores de decisión y líderes de opinión. Cuando nos acercamos hacia las sesiones de pacientes, y agradezco aquí muchísimo a Jacqueline, que somos muy amigos con ella, presidenta de una de las asociaciones de pacientes, ella y Carlos Eduardo, que es el otro presidente, me dicen: Andrés, nos parece hermoso tu nombre, pero no nos sentimos identificados porque marimba tiene demasiadas nombres y significaciones en torno al país. Y marimba queda hermoso para el Pacífico, pero no queda hermoso para el Atlántico. Entonces dijimos, yo lo primero que hice fue eso que a uno le dicen, no se enamore de su idea, lo puse en práctica esa vez porque yo era amante de ese proyecto. Entonces dijimos, listo, cambiémosle el nombre y pasamos de marimba de vida a tambores de vida. La significación de tambores de vida es que los tambores en las comunidades afrodescendientes era una forma de llamar a las comunidades, a todas las personas, a reunirse y a celebrar algo que los convocaba. Y a mí me pareció hermoso ese proyecto. Lo que logramos con ese proyecto fue generar, primero que todo, un documento que facilitara entender qué es drepanocitosis, casi como ustedes, yo también aprendí al comienzo. Segundo, cómo generamos un documento de recomendaciones. Y tercero, algo que nos pareció muy, muy interesante, es que generamos también recursos que facilitaban la apropiación y la comunicación, como les he venido diciendo, que por ejemplo fue la creación de una canción específica para ese proyecto que todavía está vivo y que las comunidades han ido trabajando de manera permanente. Ese es un ejemplo de los muchos proyectos que nosotros trabajamos. Trabajamos con VIH, trabajamos con cáncer, trabajamos con EPOC, trabajamos con crónicas no transmisibles, entre otras. También trabajamos con soluciones propias de las organizaciones que nos dicen, venga, y trabajamos con la red de cuidadores, con la red de profesionales, entre otros. En conclusión, y para ir cerrando, porque me gustó mucho lo que se hizo en el bloque pasado, que fue como esa contextualización y ese acercamiento un poco desde las bases de qué significa la innovación social. Si tú quieres ser parte de lo que significa la innovación social, si esa persona que nos está viendo y está replicando en cualquier parte del mundo quiere aprender sobre innovación social en salud, la primera gran invitación es: ¿qué buscas al impactar en social? ¿Qué es para ti impacto social? ¿Qué es para ustedes impacto social? Ustedes como organizaciones, ¿qué quieren cambiar en ese accionar, en esa solución? Lo segundo es que una vez se establezca como esa razón del por qué, utilicen es para qué. Entonces ya tengo un por qué y es la motivación, ese ethos de la innovación social. El para qué puede resultar en muchas aristas, en la innovación interna, entre emprendimiento que uno llama, o la innovación externa, que es la conexión y la capacidad de entender esos desafíos de cualquiera de los actores o de los grupos de interés con los que trabajo y darles una solución de valor que digan, esta solución es pertinente, es de impacto y me ayuda a entender muy bien mi rol dentro del ecosistema de salud. Lo tercero es siempre trabaja conectado. Siempre conéctate con esto que estás viendo acá. Conéctate de manera permanente con todos los actores. Aprende, mira las experiencias significativas y también conversa con aquellos que saben de innovación social. En el Hub siempre vas a estar invitado a venir acá para tener estas charlas, estas conversaciones, pero usa todo esto como una herramienta y un kit de herramientas que facilite esa interacción y ese aprendizaje. Siempre hay alguien que está aprendiendo de manera permanente y creo que las otras personas a uno le dan muchas luces, las otras organizaciones. Lo cuarto, siempre haz pruebas ácidas, eso sí es un tema más de método. Practica tus ideas, complementa tus ideas, habla con quienes quieres trabajar y que ellos digan esto sí, esto no. Y por último, parece un cliché, pero realmente no lo es, y es no te enamores de tus ideas en innovación social, porque en innovación social, en salud, hay muchas cosas que se van dando y el ecosistema es permanente y dinámico. Si quieres trabajar en innovación social en salud, si quieres entender innovación social en salud, es un ecosistema en permanente construcción y dinamismo. Es un ecosistema que es capaz de entender cuáles son los momentos más críticos que se están viviendo en cualquier sociedad, cómo se genera resiliencia a través de soluciones prácticas que se pueden llevar a cualquier lugar, que no son altamente costosas, sino que son de un costo que puede ser asequible, pero sobre todo que cualquier persona pueda acceder a. Y por último, si estás pensando siempre en innovación social, trata por cualquier modo colocar al paciente en el centro, a su familia, a su cuidador, a los profesionales. La red y el entramado que está ahí es la respuesta de cómo nosotros consideramos que la innovación social puede hacer cambios transformadores en los sistemas de salud del país. Agradezco mucho a Inos, agradezco mucho a Alejandro por tu invitación. Para nosotros desde el Hub siempre será un placer poder compartir estas experiencias. También para nosotros es un placer escucharlos a ustedes y aprender de ustedes, porque yo sé que al otro lado hay personas que dicen, me gustaría compartir esas ideas, bienvenidos acá. Somos un ecosistema en permanente construcción y escucha sobre todo, y algo que también quiero agradecer muchísimo a Inos y al equipo que está detrás, Tiffany, Alejandro, Carlos, es poder convertir todas esas ideas en una recomendación y en una posibilidad de movilizar política pública, porque hacia allá es donde debemos estar. Todas las acciones que uno haga en innovación social deben tener un resultado, para los tomadores de opinión, para los líderes de opinión, y también para todas las personas que día a día interactuamos con el ecosistema de salud, sin importar cuál es el rol. Muchísimas gracias a Inos, muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes los que nos están escuchando, y los invitamos a seguir conectados con Inos y con el tanque de pensamiento de salud.
Andrés, para nosotros fue un placer escucharte nuevamente. Desde luego, el agradecimiento es de parte nuestra. Habría un montón de ideas y de puntos de reflexión que valdría la pena recoger. Yo me quedaría solamente con algunos y para no extendernos demasiado, con lo que empezaste y terminaste, tener al paciente en el centro, creo que es un mensaje muy poderoso que a veces se nos pierde de vista en los tecnicismos, en el día a día, en la gestión de los recursos. A veces nos olvidamos de para quién y por quién estamos haciendo lo que hacemos. Eso creo que es fundamental. Y muchas otras cosas de las cuales también resaltaría, pues el aprendizaje, el trabajo con la comunidad, algo que decías hace unos minutos, y es que la innovación surge en muchos contextos, no solamente de base comunitaria, en los gremios, en las asociaciones de pacientes, pero por supuesto entre los profesionales, entre los académicos, entre los líderes de opinión. También hay buenas ideas que merecen ser escuchadas y ser puestas en práctica. Y juntaría esto con lo que nos decía Alex en la primera parte de esta conversación, resaltando la potencia de esas ideas creativas, simples, y que haya una voluntad de desarrollarlas con las comunidades y que eso pueda hacer esta conexión y ese match. Pues nuevamente, Andrés Gómez, gerente de Innovación Social, mil gracias. Ha sido un placer conversar contigo.
Gracias a ti, Alejandro, y a Inos.
Vale, y finalmente queremos darles a todos ustedes el agradecimiento por escucharnos, por observarnos en esta presentación del webinar, invitarles, reiterar la invitación a escuchar nuestros podcasts Territorios de Innovación en Salud que están en Spotify, y también encontrar mucha más información sobre estos desarrollos en nuestra página web, junto con los webinars que desarrollamos, las notas de opinión y todos los análisis que hacemos sobre el sistema de salud y el ecosistema de innovación. Muchísimas gracias.